Hi, everyone. We will be getting started in just a few minutes to let everyone dial in, so just hang tight. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining. My name is Cassie Rowe, Content Marketing Specialist here at 451 Research. Today's webinar, Voice of the Service Provider Infrastructure Evolution Trends, will be presented by Al Sadowski, Research Vice President for Voice of the Service Provider. Before we get started today, we would just like to do a brief introduction about 451 Research for those of you on the phone that have not heard of us before. 451 Research is a top-tier research and advisory firm headquartered in New York City. Our more than 100 analysts deliver top insights via syndicated research, advisory services, and live events around the world. Through quarterly surveys and in-depth interviews with a curated global service provider panel, 451 Research's Voice of the Service Provider helps to both qualify and quantify buying behaviors, business drivers, and strategic priorities for the expanding universe of public cloud providers, hosters, MSPs, telcos, systems integrators, SaaS companies, and colocation providers. The Voice of the Service Provider research is designed to support strategic business initiatives for technology vendors and infrastructure service providers, whether you are in product management, marketing, corporate development, or in the sales organization. Without further ado, I will turn it over to Al. He has 20-plus years experience in telco application development and product management. He is a former cloud strategist, level 3 communications specialist, focused in tracking and analyzing service provider business drivers and technology adoption trends. And he proudly serves as Research Vice President for Voice of the Service Provider. Al, take it away.
Okay, great. Thanks, Cassie. I first want to just thank you all for attending. We have a pretty good turnout here, and we truly have a global audience, so thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedules. So whether you're a hardware or software vendor seeking insights about the service provider channel, you're from the investment community, a service provider looking to see how you stack up against your peers, or enterprises that are just trying to understand infrastructure trends, I welcome all of you. All right, today's agenda. So the first thing I'm going to do is just kind of give you an overview of the reasons why service providers play such an important role for the enterprise's journey to the cloud, and kind of tee up why we established Voice of the Service Provider. Next, I'll briefly just do a product overview to give you a sense of the methodology that we use for the survey. And then we're going to dive into the actual survey results that formed our infrastructure evolution trend. And then at the end, there will be time for Q&A. There's a mechanism for you to ask questions via BrightTalk. We'll cover those at the end. And yes, these slides will be available. I know that's probably going to be a question, and they are available for download. So let's get going. Okay, so the phrase digital transformation gets tossed around way too much, but you got to just think of it as a label for the technical change required for enterprises to stay connected with their customers, their end users in new ways. It's how they can react faster to market demand and to be able to do so at scale. They need intelligence, agility, and they need customer centricity. So applying things like machine learning to create intelligence, deploying DevOps models and using APIs and containers, adding automation to create that agility, and then building these customized experience, not only for B2B customers, but B2C as well. All of this is top of mind in enterprise. So it's also top of mind for service providers as well. And all of this transformation is underpinned by the cloud. So we have a number of different data services. We have a voice of the enterprise. We ask them a number of questions over the year, and 90% of companies will be in the cloud by 2019. And some of them are initially cloud first and migrating to cloud only. The cloud first inclination is most pronounced among small businesses, but it's also happening with companies of all sizes. And we also have something that we track called best execution venue, where applications are being deployed. And by 2019, 60% of all IT deployments will be off-premise, whether it's in a private cloud or whether it's in a public cloud or hosted. And there's a lot of considerations for this. Sometimes it's cost, sometimes it's performance, security, or perhaps even as simply as time to market. But with the more spend happening outside the enterprise data center, clearly a beneficiary of that is the service providers. 90% of the Fortune 500 use a partner to access AWS. I affectionately refer to AWS as the gorilla in the room. They are top of mind for all enterprises and fellow service providers to figure out how they will work with or against AWS. So, you know, it takes a village, we like to say, but enterprises, service providers are looking to figure out how they interact with the hyperscalers. Another thing that we provide is market sizing. We have Market Monitor, and we track the size of the cloud hosting and managed services space, and we estimate that to be a $125 billion business by the end of 2018, and have a compound annual growth rate of 17%. So this market is growing. Cloud by itself is growing at a lot faster clip, but if you take the whole space together, 17%. So we see this migration to the cloud. We also see that it's not necessarily all happening in one place. Only 32% of the enterprises that we survey are planning to focus primarily on one cloud. So the rest are doing some sort of multi-cloud or hybrid cloud. So multi-cloud is just, hey, we're using various clouds for various applications. In other cases where it's like multi-cloud plus, you know, they're having workloads and data migrate between various environments. And then true hybrid cloud is really the case where it's a seamless business function that's delivered across all these environments, where multi-cloud may be, you know, I want to start in the public cloud to do test and dev and just pilot, and then when things are really cooking and it's in production, I may move it to a private environment. Hybrid is a lot more advanced at that point. And an important role for the service providers is enabling this private and public cloud orchestration and management and minimizing the complexity of having this kind of operating environment. So clearly a role, whether they are, just being an on-ramp to hyperscalers, for example, to enable hybrid. So another thing that 451 Research provides is something called the Cloud Price Index. And this was started back in 2015. And if you think about the Consumer Price Index, which tracks food and clothing and medical costs, among other things, we have a Cloud Price Index that tracks a basket of goods that contains compute and storage and networking and other services in a relative index. And you could see that, when we started it, it started at a relative index of 100, and clearly prices have come down across the board. In some regions faster than others, but across the board, the price of cloud services is on a downward trend, which is to the benefit of enterprises, making it a buyer's market. Okay, the other background, just to show how important the role of the service provider is going forward, is this shift beyond infrastructure. So we do some custom advisory work for clients. In this particular case, for the last 3 years, we've done a project for Microsoft. In 2017, there was a little over 1,700 enterprises that answered the survey. And this particular question was about their hosting and cloud services budget and how it's allocated. So you could see the beyond infrastructure trend growing. So infrastructure is just what you think it is. Beyond infrastructure, that would include things like managed services, security services, hosted applications. Infrastructure and its vital maintenance is still a big opportunity for service providers, but there is additional opportunity as well. And that's stuff we are tracking in addition. And then, of course, AWS. So there is not an enterprise CIO that is not at least asking his team, why not just go all in on a hyperscaler? There's not a service provider out there that is not trying to figure out what their role is as either a competitor, a partner to the hyperscalers as well. There are entire business segments that hold their collective breath when AWS makes product announcements in fear that they could be just put out of business altogether based on AWS or Microsoft, Google, other hyperscalers entering a particular niche that they had control over. There was one point in time where VMware was a sworn enemy of AWS, and now they are strategic partners of each other. I've been an analyst for 5 years, and initially I talked to service providers on a regular basis, and they would all talk about how they are competing with AWS, and there was a race to the bottom as far as price was concerned, and there was a lot of service providers that went out of business or changed business models or got out of public cloud altogether because of that. A few years later, service providers would say, "Oh, we don't compete with AWS. We're different from AWS." And now they're all trying to figure out how they partner with the hyperscalers as well. As part of our market monitor, we actually track the size of the cloud market, and AWS's revenue is equal to the next 200 plus service providers combined. So they're big, but they are not the only game in town. But figuring out how to partner with the hyperscalers is a big focus of service providers, and it's a big focus of our survey. So just to kind of summarize this section before we move into the next part. So as you can see, enterprises are much more interconnected than ever across multiple venues. It's clearly a buyer's market, but we're also seeing a blurring of the lines as to what even a service provider is. As Cassie mentioned, we have system integrators and public cloud providers and telcos, distributors, MSPs, colo providers that are now moving up the stack to offer cloud, hosters. But we even see vendors that are not only providers themselves, but they're also technology suppliers to other service providers. So the market is definitely evolving. There's a lot of disruption, but reacting to the market is an imperative for enterprises, and it's equally important for a service provider as well. Partnering is clearly something that is growing in interest among service providers. It's something that the vendor community is clearly trying to get a handle on as well. As I said, some companies that were once competitors are now trying to figure out whether or not being a partner is now a survival tactic going forward. But in the end, there's more and more money being spent outside the enterprise data center, and that's what's making enterprise or service providers much more important buying center for all the software, hardware, and services vendors. And that is the reason why we created Voice of the Service Provider. Okay, so what I'm going to quickly do in a few slides is just give you a little more detail as to what Voice of the Service Provider is, the methodology. So we have a panel of decision makers on the business side of the service provider. So we're not focused on the engineering and operations and the development side. We're talking about people that are more on the product side, corporate development, people who influence the roadmaps. In order to participate in the panel, the service provider has to have at least $1 million in revenue and 10 employees. If somebody's merely just reselling Office 365, or it's a SaaS vendor that's all in on the public cloud, they're not part of the scope. These are infrastructure-based companies, so asset-light system integrators would not be included either. So that's the panel. And then the other thing I'll share is the quarterly themes. So I will be presenting today insights based on our first quarter that we published. That advisory report is complete. The survey is done. The analysis is out. And that's the insight I'll share. It's about infrastructure evolution. We focus on a lot of different technologies, and I'll get into a lot more detail about that. The survey that's in the field currently is all about differentiation and vendor selection. So, and I will share a little bit more detail of the specific target areas there. And that survey is in the field currently, and the results will be published at the end of June, beginning of July. Then in the third quarter, the focus is budgets and spending. Where is the service provider spending its money today? Where they plan to be spending it going forward? What are their economic motivations to do a server refresh? Things like that is the focus. And then the fourth quarter, it's all about workloads and key projects. What are they going to be working on? But not only do I want to know whether or not they're going to be adding a PaaS platform, but what makes up the stack? What's the software, the hardware, the services that make up these products and services that they're offering? And another key element of this is when we ask all these questions about to the service providers, it is focused on their customer-facing products and services. It's not necessarily asking about how they are deploying email or ERP internally. It's about the scale part of their business, the customer-facing part of the business. Okay. Next slide here is a snapshot of the Voice of the Service Provider panel demographics. So 1/3 of the respondents are in the US, 1/3 are in the UK, and 1/3 are in Asia. And we specifically focused on the two biggest markets, India and China, for now, with plans to grow the regional representation over time. From a revenue standpoint, you could see the breakdown of the types of customers. Anywhere from $1 million all the way up to $1 billion+ companies are covered. And the provider types are equally distributed amongst 5 different types in the first quarter. And you could see also the breakdown of the job titles by region as well. So again, you have to be at least a director or above in order to participate in the Voice of the Service Provider panel. We even have screener questions that if once they get into the survey, if they say don't know 3 times, we actually kick them out because they clearly aren't the type of person that we're looking for because they don't have a good handle on the overall business. Okay, so now we're going to dive into the actual survey results from the first quarter, the Infrastructure Evolution Survey. This was just published in May, so this is brand new, fresh data. The one thing I'll point out here is that the data collection and data management practices that make up this survey are ISO 22252 compliant, and there's a annual audit of those processes to ensure that data collection adheres to the ISO standards. And here's the breakdown of the topics we covered in the first quarter. So I am not going to go through every single survey result. I picked out a couple of highlights that to give you a sense for the general direction of the infrastructure evolution trends, but we cover not only the service provider business drivers and asking about the amount of transformation they require and what their top pain points are. We touch on differentiation. That's a topic that we'll get into a lot more detail in the second quarter. Their general approach for working with technology suppliers. You know, I will get into IoT a little bit more. And then likely vendors that they are considering for compute and storage and networking. I'll dive into that one a little bit. And again, that's another deep dive for the second quarter. This second section here is all about the different technologies. Again, I am not going to get into every single one of these, but there are a number of different technologies that are top of mind, whether it's from the physical hardware itself or potentially software or just other capabilities. Those are all covered in this survey. I will touch on a couple of them. And then finally, we ask questions about how enterprises service providers plan to expand their services portfolio, and also what they're going to do about their physical data centers going forward. And there's some interesting insights that we'll get from that as well. So just to start, so this was a question that we asked about vendor selection criteria, and clearly service providers want to deliver reliable services, so they need reliable hardware and software. So probably not a surprise there. But I think of interest is that service providers are much more interested in a vendor's technical expertise than their brand. Loyalty, as the survey results show, is not as important as being able to receive a quality product or a quality customer support experience. For example, having a robust list of products and features, the breadth of products and features, is not as important as having good customer support. So a lot of interesting insights about the vendor selection criteria. In the second quarter, we go into a lot more detail into the reasons why they pick the suppliers that they pick. So this chart represents a snapshot of the products and services that a service provider is offering. So there's a number of service providers on the call today. You can take note of how you stack up against the rest of these, but this is the snapshot of the average service provider. So 64% of the panelists are offering some sort of backup and DR capability. It's the highest, and it's not surprising. That's typically the first product or service that an enterprise is going to try in the cloud. Because security is top of mind for enterprises, it's got to be top of mind for service providers, and that is why security services are now a big offering. And as I mentioned before, in that beyond infrastructure spend bucket, security services and managed security capabilities is a big focus. Managed hosting, public cloud, private cloud are all about half. Professional services, something to point out here. So as enterprises journey to the cloud, whether it's application monitor the modernization capabilities, migration services. There's a lot of professional services help that an enterprise needs, and increasingly service providers are adding that. And you'll notice bare metal on the end. Bare metal is not a brand new concept. It's been around for a long time, but there's renewed interest in it, especially with the growing interest in containers. And for some applications with specific performance characteristics, there's a growing need for bare metal. But again, it also requires capital to deploy. So about a third have that capability. So there's your snapshot of the average service provider. And then we asked the question about where you offer services today and where do you offer services going forward. Now, these dots do not represent the 226 panelists. There could be multiple dots per service provider. You can see that United States, UK, India are amongst the biggest, but the panel was concentrated in those areas. But EU shows a significant interest, and that is because of things like Brexit and GDPR. The blue dots that are solid blue dots, that is current providers offering services today. If it is a current provider that's expanding services in the same region, that's the blue dot with the orange around it. And then net new expansion, so going into a new region for the first time, is orange. So you could see that Latin America and other parts of APAC have the most new entrants. And you'll notice there's not new entrants in China. China is a hard market to get into. There's some very dominant players there. So service providers are looking to support the region from other parts of the country, other parts of the region, for example. There's a lot of interesting data here based on the types of service providers and the size of companies and things like that, but this is a general snapshot about the overall mix. Okay, so we talked at the beginning about the transformation required for an enterprise, but it's also required for the service provider in order to support them. And you can do the math here. 77% of the service providers in the survey require some level of transformation. So this might be they need to figure out how to be better, add more automation capabilities. They need to fix their, their scalability. They need to understand lifecycle management, moving off of legacy capabilities onto new stuff. Security obviously is a big focus. Networking, even on the physical data center itself, what they're doing about power distribution and cooling as you get into more specialized hardware, and then obviously reliability and availability. There's a lot of things that get unpacked with transformation, and clearly an opportunity for the vendor community to help service providers with this transformation. Okay, so the service provider pain points. Probably if we were to match this up against the enterprise pain points, they're probably very similar because service providers are looking to address enterprise concerns. The number one concern for an enterprise moving to the cloud is security. So it's obviously the number one concern for a service provider as well. Flexibility, cost, clearly there's a lot of things that probably make sense here. But one thing to note is that vendor management is actually a bigger pain point than their own staffing problems. So, clearly an opportunity for vendors to make themselves easy to do business with, for example. Okay, so what we asked of the service providers was, hey, so when you run out of space or power, what are you going to do? And we asked them about some specific choices here. And what's interesting is that, let me just build this out, is at the top of the list here are more OpEx related capabilities, and the things towards the bottom are more CapEx focused. And there is clearly an interest amongst service providers to spend less and less capital on building new data centers or buying new data centers. They want to take advantage of their existing investments. So, consolidating IT infrastructure, retrofitting, expanding existing. These are, they want to take advantage of the stuff they already have in place. But you'll also notice that service providers aren't afraid to utilize off-premise public cloud, and we'll see that also in the case of specifically around compute and storage, the interest in leveraging public cloud resources rather than investing in additional physical assets. So that is the physical data center. And now we'll kind of migrate deeper from the data center floor into the rack and into specific equipment over the next group of slides here. So we asked service providers the primary driver. So there's a lot of drivers. What's the primary driver for doing a server, a storage refresh, a replacement, or upgrades? And you could see the two bookends on this particular slide is the bulk of the reason. So they're adding capacity because the existing equipment is, getting up there in age, or on the right side, it's because they need to just add capacity. But you'll notice the driver for a service provider is not necessarily because they're looking for access to a new form factor or a new capability. It's really because they need additional capacity and they're going to add based on that. So very interesting findings. Clearly, a lot of vendors that I've spoken to already are interested to unpack this a little further to understand why in the third quarter we get into a little deeper in the economic motivations for some of these things. So moving up from the data center floor, now we're inside the rack, and very specifically inside talking about the servers themselves. And we ask about the types of servers that are installed today. That's the dark blue. And what's going to be installed in 12 months from now. Clearly Intel and AMD are very important for the service providers. So this is not necessarily showing a relative scale in terms of spend, but it's really just asking the types of stuff that's going to be installed. You can see the one highlight here is ARM. There's a lot of interest in ARM, and that is because of ARM's cost and flexibility have shown a lot of promise for specific workloads. We'll get into GPUs a little bit later. It's also interesting to note that mainframe, long live the mainframe. Everybody thought that by now it would be dead, but clearly it's still there. A big portion of that on-premise or non-cloud infrastructure is mainframe. So earlier I said 60% of the workloads will be in a cloud environment by 2019, and part of this stuff that's going to remain behind is mainframe, for example. Okay. All right. So IoT, edge computing. Enterprises are interested in these capabilities. Service providers are trying to figure out how they are going to support it. There's a big focus here. All of that data that's collected from all these endpoints needs to be stored somewhere. It needs to be transported by different mechanisms, or it needs to have some way to get it from point A to point B. There's still debate as to what point A is and what point B is. It could be the device, it could be an edge data center, it could be a cell tower, it could be a central repository. It all depends on the the latency, performance, and storage requirements in order to do this. But it's what's fascinating here is that with all the talk and discussion about IoT, 21%, actually you can say the ones that don't know as well, 23% of the service providers don't know what they're going to do about IoT yet. It's something that they clearly need to figure out, and there's probably an opportunity here for vendors to help them. We have an entire channel of research that is specifically focused on IoT. The fact that 44% are planning to partner with industry leaders and their PaaS platforms is a good thing. The fact that some will try to offer their own PaaS platforms might not be the best route forward. I used to work in the telco space, not the greatest industry as far as writing software and delivering it. So partnering is a good strategy to focus on for this particular case. But we have a lot more research on the IoT space from our IoT experts. Okay, moving on. So I took just a few of those technologies that I pointed out from the first quarter survey, and we asked service providers their plans to offer any of these as a service. There was a lot more that we asked. I just took a couple of them. This GPUs and accelerators thing, it's the same data that was on the other slide, but today 14% have some sort of GPU offering in their portfolio, and 20% plan to add it in the next 12 months. Containers and container management, it has a lot of benefits, and the interest here is growing as well. Microservices, not a lot of people doing it today. It's something that a lot of service providers are leaving to the hyperscalers, but some are definitely diving into this capability. There's the proprietary capabilities of the big hyperscalers. There's open source alternatives, but depending on the size of the service provider, will depend on the interest level in deploying some of these capabilities based on the data. The fact that only 8% of service providers are going to be doing big data or 7% machine learning is not necessarily a bad thing, because they already are widely deployed today, but they will continue to evolve those capabilities, because as I mentioned earlier, that intelligence, taking data and turning it into actionable intelligence, is a big focus of enterprises, and having these big data processing engines and machine learning and AI capabilities enable that. Okay. All right, so I'm going to leave you with 3 final trends, one regarding compute, one regarding network, and one regarding storage that should be watched. The first one is, and I kind of touched on this a little bit, but when we ask service providers, hey, when you need new compute, where are you going to get it from? And there's the typical hardware vendors that you would typically see in a survey show up, but the top vote getter was public cloud. So this isn't that they are definitely going to do it, but they are likely to use public cloud for the next compute purchase. And if you think about it, you're not a tier 1 service provider, and you want to launch a new product. Do you want to go invest in a lot of hardware in the hope that they come, or do you take a much lower risk direction, something that is OpEx based rather than CapEx based, and test it out, leveraging the compute capabilities and the storage capabilities of a tier 1 cloud provider, prove it out that it works, and then consider bringing it in-house. So the hyperscalers as a compute supplier is something to watch. Storage, for that matter, as well. The next one is related to networking. 52% of the service providers over the next 12 months are planning to deploy generic hardware and SDN capabilities for their external networking. So there are the traditional hardware suppliers on the networking side that are also coming out with software-defined versions of what they've offered, but there's clearly an interest in x86 for networking. We ask a similar question about the internal data center as well. The percentage is not as high, but there's a growing percentage for networking within the data center as well. And depending on the type of service provider, the interest grows more, especially based on the revenue of the service provider. They have more resources to dedicate to these particular capabilities, so there's more interest on their part versus the companies with not as many resources, smaller revenue targets that are typically more often are not going to use the traditional capabilities. And then finally is around storage. So we ask about various types of storage footprints and architectures, and the interest in converged and hyper-converged platforms among service providers is growing. These platforms are easier to provision. They're quicker to grow the estate, and service providers are just looking for simplicity. So three things to watch. Okay, so I don't know about you, but I'm required to travel a lot. Sometimes it's to Asia. When you're on a plane for 16 hours one way, you get to watch a lot of movies. So I watched Dunkirk and Darkest Hours while sitting on an airplane. Winston Churchill, World War II focus, and one of his quotes was, "This is not the end. It is not even the beginning of the end, but it is perhaps the end of the beginning." And this not only applies to service providers and their role in the IT journey, but it also applies to voice of the service provider itself. We are at the end of the beginning. So we have the second quarter survey coming soon. It will focus on service provider differentiation. We ask them how they think they're different. We ask about the top verticals that they serve today and where they expect growth to come from. We ask about their relationship with the hyperscalers now and what they think that's going to look like in the future. We ask about their preferred vendor attributes for compute and storage and private cloud management and co-location, amongst others. And then we dive in specifically about vendor partner programs. I get a lot of questions from service providers and from vendors as to the motivations for joining, what their interests are. So we actually are quantifying now the reasons why service providers are joining vendor programs, their satisfaction with SLAs and warranties, and what the contract terms look like, what they do about procurement and sparing strategies, and then there's a whole host of professional services and ancillary services that the vendor community offers, especially on the hardware side, and we are quantifying that as well. So that's coming. My final slide is really just an explanation of what you get with Voice of the Service Provider. Cassie kind of gave an overview. I talked about the roadmap. So as somebody who purchases Voice of the Service Provider, you get access to all the data sets, all the top line charts and figures, as well as the advisory report. It's available enterprise-wide, and we allow rights to internally and externally distribute the data. Myself and other analysts that cover this space do inquiry based on this, and then there's obviously other things we can do to help with go-to-market and things like that come up. So I did a lot of talking. We covered a lot of various technologies that make up the cloud community and infrastructure. So we're going to now turn it over to Cassie. And Cassie, I believe there are some questions that we can take at this point. I appreciate you guys all making the time, but yes, let's go to the Q&A now.
Great. So before we jump into the Q&A, I just want to thank everyone again for attending. And as attendees to this webinar, you can use this code here to receive a $200 discount to attend our Hosting Cloud and Transformation Summit out in September. It's our largest event of the year. It's out in Las Vegas. It's a ton of fun. You should really think about attending if you can make it. And just remember to save that code and use it for your discount. So going into our Q&A, we have a bunch of questions, but the first one for you, Al, is you said that hyperconverged is of interest in the future. Is this the case in all regions?
Oh, okay. So, yeah, so the way we ask the question and the way we break it out, so what I shared was just generic top line percentages with the whole panel. But when we look at specifically hyperconverged, one of the biggest regions that shows interest in hyperconverged was China compared to others. And as I mentioned, based on the size, the revenue size, the interest in hyperconverged is also different as well. But China is probably the top region as far as interest in hyperconverged over time. Awesome, thanks. The next question is, in the presentation, the first quarter survey says it included questions about open compute technology. Is there anything you can share here about open compute technology trends? Yes, I wonder if I could find something real quick. We asked questions about not only open compute itself, but we asked questions about their interest in other types of networking technologies. But there is growing interest in open compute. We asked about ONAP and eComp and some others as well. I think the takeaway is that service providers are hedging their bets and trying out various technologies in order to see which one is going to create the most groundswell. But we do have several questions about the technology used on the open source side of networking. Great, thanks. So we have a few more questions here. We won't be able to get to them all, I believe. But one question we received is, can you dig a little deeper into what service providers value and look for in a partner program? Sorry, can you say that one again? Sure, it is, can you dig a little deeper into what service providers value and look for in a partner program? Yeah, so that's actually a specific question that we're asking in the second quarter as far as the reasons why, what are their motivations. So there's obviously a pick list of things that include they want access to training, they want access to marketing dollars, they want access to joint selling, there's a whole bunch of potential reasons why, and there was a number of vendors that helped create that pick list, if you will. But that's something that we will be able to quantify in greater detail after the second quarter results come in later this month. Great. So whoever had a chance to ask that question, be sure to keep out for Q2's survey results. Next question we have here is, any insights into the software cloud stack they use? Are they using VMware or OpenStack or Azure Stack or Cloud Stack? I'm assuming they is service providers. Yep. Sure. So out of that group, we asked in the first quarter their interest in OpenStack. There is and at the OpenStack Summit, they actually referenced this data. If you include service providers that are doing not only OpenStack in production today, but also ones in pilot or planning to implement over the next 24 months, it was over 70% of them. But again, pilots doesn't necessarily mean it turns into interest, but we do quantify the interest in OpenStack. In the second quarter, we specifically asked them what software they are using to orchestrate private clouds, and if they plan to continue using that software going forward. And it does include all of those things that were mentioned, Azure Stack and Cloud Stack and OpenStack and VMware. So that will be provided in greater detail in next quarter survey as well.
Excellent. Does this Voice of the Service Provider study include a spreadsheet of the free-form narrative responses similar to the Voice of the Enterprise studies?
The short answer is yes. So in addition to the online surveys from the 226 service providers in the first quarter, we also did in-depth interviews with 20 service providers, and that information was quantified into a narrative searchable database, just like our Voice of the Enterprise product is.
All right, excellent. We have time for one more question this morning here on the East Coast. What is the public cloud versus private cloud trend? Public cloud continues to grow, question mark?
Okay, so clearly the public cloud is growing. The movement from enterprises from on-premise to off-premise is growing. There is also interest in using private cloud depending on the workload type. We do a lot of analysis as to not the breaking point, but the pivot point as to where a workload should be deployed, whether it's more economically feasible to deploy it in a public cloud or a private cloud, depending on the number of virtual machines that an enterprise engineer can manage plays a big factor into that decision. But our market monitor data shows public cloud growth, shows private cloud growth, shows a trend towards the interest in each, and it really comes down to an application by application basis as to the best execution venue for those workloads.
Great. Well, unfortunately, that's all the time we have for questions. Sorry if we did not get to yours, but as Al clearly indicated, there's going to be a ton of great research coming out for Q2 based on some of your questions. So you're welcome to come back and join us for that webinar. And thank you for joining us today. As you may have noticed by now, that the slides are in the attachment section of BrightTalk. The replay of this webinar will be available right afterwards, right at this IP address, where you can watch the replay at any time. And yeah, thank you, Al, for presenting with us today.
Yeah, thanks, Cassie, and thank you all for hanging in there, and welcome any feedback that you may have going forward.
Great, and speaking of feedback, there is a feedback from the audience section on your page. Feel free to leave us a review and let us know how we're doing and how we can improve for next time. Thank you, everybody. Have a great rest of your day.